The evening of May the 15th, 1848, would forever remain etched in Lady Arabella Fairfax's memory as the night her heart shattered into 1,000 crystalline pieces upon the polished marble floor of the Whitmore Ballroom. She had arrived at the grand townhouse on Berkeley Square with her elderly chaperone, Mrs. Gardiner. Her modest gown of pale lavender silk, a quiet contrast to the jewel-toned satins and elaborate embroidery worn by ladies of greater fortune. At 23, Arabella possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly, like dawn breaking over a misty landscape. Her features were regular rather than striking, her figure slender and graceful, and her dark brown hair fell in soft waves that framed a face notable primarily for its expressiveness and the intelligence that shone from eyes the color of warm honey. She had no great dowry to recommend her, no powerful family connections to elevate her status, merely a modest competence left by her late father and the small estate in Derbyshire that provided barely enough income to maintain her mother and younger sister in genteel comfort. What she did possess, however, was a mind that delighted in literature and philosophy, a genuine warmth of character that endeared her to those who knew her well, and a secret that had burned in her breast for 2 full seasons. She was desperately, hopelessly, completely in love with Frederick Wentworth, the Duke of Claiborne, a man so far above her in rank and fortune that her affection was nothing short of foolishness. The Whitmore Ballroom blazed with the light of 3 magnificent chandeliers, their countless candles reflecting off gilded mirrors and casting a warm glow over the assembled cream of London society. Ladies in their finest gowns clustered in groups, their fans fluttering like butterfly wings as they exchanged gossip, while gentlemen in severe black evening coats stood in conversation near the tall windows that overlooked the square. The orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end of the room, and the air was heavy with the mingled scents of beeswax perfume and the elaborate floral arrangements that adorned every available surface. Arabella stood near a marble column, partially concealed from the main press of the crowd, as was her custom at such events. She had learned over the years that her modest circumstances made her an object of neither particular interest nor outright disdain, rendering her effectively invisible to most of the ton. This suited her well enough, as it allowed her to observe without being observed, to watch the intricate dance of society from a safe distance. Tonight, however, her usual position of quiet observation served a more painful purpose. From where she stood, she had an unobstructed view of the raised dais where Lord Whitmore stood with several distinguished guests, and among them, towering over the others with the unconscious authority that came from both his impressive height and his ancient title, was Frederick. The Duke of Claiborne was 38 years of age, with the kind of aristocratic features that seemed carved from stone until something amused him, and his rare smile transformed his entire countenance. His hair was dark, almost black, with distinguished threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes were a striking pale grey that could appear cold as winter frost or warm as morning mist depending on his mood. He possessed broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored coat admirably, and moved with the unconscious grace of a man completely comfortable in his own skin and certain of his place in the world. For 2 seasons, Arabella had nurtured her hopeless attachment, treasuring every small interaction between them. There had been a dance at the Moorland Musicale 16 months ago, during which he had actually laughed at her observation about the soprano's dramatic interpretation of a rather simple piece. There had been a chance meeting at Hatchard's bookshop, where they had spent 20 glorious minutes discussing the merits of the new novel by Mr. Dickens. There had been a garden party at the Tilney estate, where he had sought her out specifically to continue a conversation about Italian art that they had begun at a previous gathering. She knew these encounters meant nothing to him, merely pleasant interludes with an agreeable acquaintance, but to her they were precious jewels to be examined and treasured in the privacy of her chamber. She had never allowed herself to believe that anything could come of her feelings, had never been so foolish as to imagine that a duke would look twice at a lady of her limited circumstances. but she had also never quite managed to extinguish the small, stubborn flame of hope that burned somewhere deep in her chest. The orchestra fell silent midway through a country dance, and a ripple of curiosity passed through the assembled guests as Lord Whitmore raised his hand for attention. Arabella felt her heart begin to beat faster, though she could not have said why. Perhaps it was merely the presence of Frederick on the dais, his tall figure impossible to ignore, even in a room crowded with London's elite. Lord Whitmore's voice carried easily across the now silent ballroom as he announced that his dear friend, the Duke of Claiborne, had requested the honor of sharing some happy news with those gathered. Arabella watched as Frederick stepped forward, his expression unreadable, his posture perfect. He surveyed the crowd with those pale grey eyes, and for just one moment, one heartbeat, his gaze seemed to find hers across the distance, seemed to hold there for a fraction of a second before moving on. Then he spoke, his deep voice clear and firm, and the words fell upon Arabella like blows from a hammer. He was pleased to announce his engagement to Lady Henrietta Dashwood, daughter of the Earl of Pemberton, a union that would join two ancient and distinguished families. The ballroom erupted in a chorus of congratulations and excited whispers, but Arabella heard none of it. Her vision tunneled, the glittering scene before her wavering as though she viewed it through water. Lady Henrietta Dashwood. Of course, the Earl's daughter was everything Arabella was not, a diamond of the first water with pale blonde hair, classical features of striking beauty, and a dowry rumoured to be in excess of £30,000. She was cold in manner, with a reputation for cutting wit and social ambition, but she was eminently suitable for a duke. Arabella's stays, which her maid had laced that morning with the usual firmness, suddenly felt as though they were crushing her ribs, preventing air from reaching her lungs. The room spun, the candlelight from the chandeliers blurring into streaks of gold against the darkness creeping in from the edges of her vision. She tried to draw breath, tried to maintain her composure, tried to do anything other than what she was about to do. But her body had other ideas. The last thing she registered before darkness claimed her completely was the cool smoothness of marble against her cheek as the floor rushed up to meet her, and the eruption of shocked gasps and exclamations that her collapse provoked. Consciousness returned slowly, bringing with it awareness of softness beneath her, the acrid scent of smelling salts, and voices speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Arabella's eyelids felt impossibly heavy, but she forced them open to find herself lying upon a velvet settee in what appeared to be a private parlour off the main ballroom. The room was smaller, more intimate, decorated in shades of cream and gold with a fire crackling gently in the hearth. Mrs. Gardiner's anxious face swam into view, her elderly features creased with concern, but it was not her chaperone's voice that Arabella heard first. It was his. Frederick's deep tones, rough with something that might have been worry, instructing someone to fetch water and to give her air. Arabella turned her head, confused and disoriented, to find the Duke of Claiborne himself kneeling beside the settee. His coat discarded, his cravat slightly loosened, his pale eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. His fingers, long and elegant, rested against her wrist, checking her pulse with a familiarity that should have been scandalous. The impropriety of the situation began to penetrate her foggy awareness. He had carried her here. She knew this with sudden certainty, could almost feel the phantom sensation of being lifted against a broad chest, cradled in strong arms. The Duke of Claiborne, who had just announced his engagement to another woman, had carried her unconscious form from the ballroom in full view of London society. The scandal would be tremendous. Mrs. Gardiner was speaking now, her voice fluttering with distress about the heat of the ballroom and Arabella's delicate constitution, but Frederick seemed not to hear her. He leaned closer, so close that Arabella could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, could detect the faint scent of sandalwood, and something uniquely him. His lips moved, forming words so quiet that only she could hear them, words that made no sense yet sent a shiver down her spine despite her confusion. "Trust me, Arabella. This engagement is a cage I am building, but not for myself. For the wolf hunting you." Before she could respond, before she could even process the meaning of his cryptic message, the parlor door swept open, and Lady Henrietta Dashwood entered in a rustle of ice-blue silk. She was even more beautiful up close than from a distance, with features of such classical perfection they might have been sculpted by a Greek master. Her pale blue eyes took in the scene before her, the Duke kneeling at another woman's side, and something flickered across her face too quickly to identify before her expression settled into one of cool concern. Behind her came Mrs. Gardiner's niece, who had apparently been sent to fetch the chaperone, and several other ladies drawn by curiosity. Frederick rose immediately, his movements fluid despite his size, and stepped back from the settee with the proper distance society demanded. His expression had shifted, transformed from the intensity of moments before into the cool, aristocratic mask Arabella recognized from public gatherings. He bowed formally to Lady Henrietta, who extended her hand to him with the proprietary air of a woman claiming what was hers. "My dear Duke," Lady Henrietta said, her voice like crystal, beautiful but cold, "how fortunate that you were near when poor Lady Fairfax took ill. Such a kind heart you have, to concern yourself with her welfare." The words were perfectly appropriate, but something in their delivery, some subtle emphasis, felt like a verbal blade disguised in silk. Arabella struggled to sit up, mortification flooding through her as the full weight of what had occurred crashed over her consciousness. She had fainted at the announcement of Frederick's engagement like some weak-spirited maiden from a Gothic novel. She had caused a scene at one of the season's most important balls. She had been carried, unconscious and helpless, by the very man whose engagement had caused her collapse, and now she lay here, while his intended bride looked on with those cold, assessing eyes. Mrs. Gardiner fussed over her, pressing a glass of water into her hands and suggesting they depart immediately for home, but Arabella could not seem to make her limbs cooperate. Her mind kept circling back to Frederick's whispered words, trying to extract meaning from them. A cage for the wolf hunting you. What wolf? Who was hunting her? And why would Frederick's engagement to Lady Henrietta provide protection? None of it made sense, and yet the urgency in his voice had been unmistakable, as had been something else she dared not name. Frederick was speaking now, his voice returned to its usual measured tones, as he assured Mrs. Gardiner that such episodes were not uncommon in overheated ballrooms, that Lady Fairfax should not distress herself, that he was certain she would recover quickly with proper rest. He did not look at Arabella again, did not acknowledge by word or glance the intimate moment they had shared, the cryptic warning he had delivered. Instead, he offered his arm to Lady Henrietta and suggested they return to the ballroom where their guests awaited. Lady Henrietta accepted with a smile that did not reach her eyes, but before they departed, she paused beside the settee where Arabella sat and bent down as though to offer some private word of comfort. What she actually whispered, her voice so low that only Arabella could hear, sent another shock through her already overwhelmed system. "He does care for you, you know, more than is wise. That is precisely why this must appear real." Then she straightened, her public smile firmly in place, and swept from the room on Frederick's arm, leaving Arabella to wonder if she had imagined the entire exchange, or if she had somehow stumbled into a plot whose parameters she could not begin to comprehend. Mrs. Gardiner insisted they leave immediately, and Arabella, still shaky and desperately wanting to escape the pitying and curious glances of the other ladies, agreed without protest. As their modest carriage rolled through the lamp-lit streets of London toward their small house in Bloomsbury, Arabella stared out at the passing buildings and tried to make sense of the evening's extraordinary events. Frederick was engaged to Lady Henrietta Dashwood. This was fact, announced publicly before hundreds of witnesses. Yet he had whispered of cages and wolves, had looked at her with an intensity that belied mere friendly concern. and his intended bride had made that strange, conspiratorial comment that suggested she knew of his feelings and somehow approved of them. It made no sense. Nothing made sense. And yet beneath her confusion and heartbreak, beneath the humiliation of her very public collapse, a small seed of hope had taken root, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Whatever game was being played, whatever mysterious threat Frederick had alluded to, one thing seemed increasingly clear. His engagement to Lady Henrietta was not what it appeared to be, and somehow, impossibly, Arabella herself was at the very centre of it all. The note arrived on the third morning after the Whitmore ball, slipped beneath the door of the modest Bloomsbury townhouse that Arabella shared with her mother and younger sister, discovered by the maid when she came to lay the morning fire. It was a single sheet of expensive cream paper, folded and sealed with plain wax bearing no identifying mark, and the direction was written in a hand Arabella did not immediately recognize, though something about the bold, decisive strokes made her pulse quicken even before she broke the seal. The message inside was brief, almost curt in its brevity. Vauxhall Gardens, The Maze, twilight today. Come alone. Trust no one with this note. There was no signature, no explanation, nothing to indicate who had sent it or why they requested such a clandestine meeting in a location notorious for romantic assignations and scandalous encounters. Every rational part of Arabella's mind screamed that she should ignore this summons, should show the note to Mrs. Gardiner, or perhaps even to her mother, should certainly not venture alone to meet an unknown correspondent as dusk fell over London. Yet she knew with a certainty that defied logic that the note had come from Frederick, that his hand had formed those letters even if he had disguised his usual script, that he needed to speak with her away from the prying eyes and eager ears of society. The 3 days since the ball had been an agony of confusion and speculation. The morning papers had been full of the Duke of Claiborne's engagement to Lady Henrietta Dashwood, describing it as the match of the season, speculating on the wedding date, and listing in tedious detail the combined wealth and influence the union would bring to both families. There had been, mercifully, only brief mention of a lady taken ill during the announcement, with no name attached to spare Arabella the additional humiliation of being identified as the woman who had collapsed at the news. She had remained at home, pleading a continued indisposition, unable to face the inevitable questions, and barely concealed pity that would await her in society's drawing rooms. Her mother, a vague and gentle woman who had never quite recovered from the shock of being widowed at 40, had fussed over her with tisanes and concern, while her sister Lydia, at 17 full of romantic notions and dramatic sensibilities, had declared the whole business monstrously unfair and insisted that the Duke must have been coerced into the engagement by family pressure. Arabella had said nothing, had kept Frederick's cryptic words locked away in her heart, examining them in the privacy of her chamber like a miser counting coins. A cage for the wolf hunting ewe. She had turned the phrase over and over, trying to extract meaning, trying to identify who this wolf might be and why Frederick believed her in danger. Now, it seemed, she would have answers. The day passed with agonizing slowness, each hour marked by the elegant French clock in the drawing-room that had been her grandmother's and was one of the few valuable items remaining from better days. Arabella pleaded a headache to avoid joining her mother and sister for their usual afternoon calls, and instead retired to her chamber to prepare for the evening's secret expedition. She selected a walking dress of dark grey merino wool, practical and unremarkable, with a hooded cloak that would help conceal her identity in the fading light. Her maid, Jenny, a girl of 15 who had been with the family since childhood and could be trusted with secrets, helped. Her dress and said nothing about the unusual choice of attire for a lady supposedly confined to bed with illness. As the light began to fade from the spring sky, Arabella slipped from the house through the servants' entrance, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had told her mother she would take an early night, and with luck would return before her absence was discovered. The streets of London at twilight were a different world from the genteel avenues she traversed during daylight hours. Lamplighters made their rounds, touching flame to gas lamps that bloomed like flowers against the gathering darkness, while vendors called their final wares and workers hurried home to their suppers. Arabella kept her hood pulled low and moved quickly, aware of her vulnerability as a woman alone, but driven by a need stronger than caution. She hired a hackney cab at the corner, giving the driver directions to Vauxhall Gardens in a voice she tried to keep steady. The pleasure gardens were a popular destination for all classes of London society, from aristocrats seeking entertainment to merchants' families enjoying a holiday. But they were also known as a place where anonymity could be purchased, and discretion was the unofficial currency. The driver gave her a knowing look that made her cheeks burn, but accepted her fare without comment and set off through the crowded streets toward the river. The journey across the Thames seemed to take an eternity, and Arabella used the time to rehearse what she might say to Frederick, how she might maintain her composure in his presence, how she might keep her heart from revealing itself too plainly. The gardens were already illuminated when she arrived. Thousands of colored lamps strung through the trees and along the walking paths, creating a fairy tale atmosphere that belied the often questionable activities that occurred in the darker corners of the grounds. Arabella paid the driver and entered through the main gate, where revelers in various states of gaiety milled about, some already showing the effects of the wine and arak punch for which the gardens were famous. She moved through the crowds with her head down, following the well-worn paths toward the famous maze that occupied the eastern section of the ground. The maze at Vauxhall was constructed of high hedges of hornbeam and yew, planted so densely that they formed walls of living green through which no eye could penetrate. It had been designed a century earlier by a landscape architect with a fondness for geometric complexity, and its twisting paths and dead ends had frustrated and delighted visitors for generations. By day it was a pleasant diversion. By twilight it became something else entirely, a shadowy labyrinth where the sounds of the outside world grew muffled and distant, where one might wander for half an hour trying to find the center or the exit. Arabella entered the maze as the last light bled from the sky, her pulse racing as the hedge walls rose, up on either side, blocking out the lamp-lit festivities of the main gardens. She moved slowly, one gloved hand trailing along the hedge to keep her bearings, as the path twisted left, then right, then left again. The air was cool and slightly damp, carrying the green scent of growing things and the distant sound of music from the orchestra pavilion. She had no idea how to find Frederick in this leafy labyrinth, had no plan beyond walking until he found her, and was just beginning to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake, when a figure materialized from the mist that was gathering in the low places between the hedges. He stood at the junction of two paths, tall and unmistakable even in silhouette, and relief flooded through her so powerfully that she nearly stumbled. Frederick moved toward her quickly, closing the distance between them in a few long strides, and she saw that he wore dark, plain clothing rather than his usual aristocratic attire, as though he too sought to avoid recognition. His face, as the fading light caught it, was grave, almost harsh, with lines of strain around his mouth that she had not noticed 3 nights ago. He glanced past her down the path she had taken, checking that she had not been followed, before his pale eyes settled on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice mixed with something darker. "I was not certain you would after my cryptic message." "I almost did not," Arabella admitted, trying to keep her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. It was foolish to come alone to such a place, on the word of an unsigned note. It was, Frederick agreed, a muscle working in his jaw. "But I could think of no other way to speak with you privately. What I must tell you cannot be overheard, and every drawing-room in London has ears." He gestured down one of the paths. "Walk with me. I know the way to the centre. No one will disturb us there." Arabella fell into step beside him, acutely aware of his presence, of the breadth of his shoulders beneath the dark coat, of the way he shortened his naturally long stride to match hers. They walked in silence for several minutes, navigating the twists and turns of the maze until they emerged into the circular clearing at its heart. Here, a stone bench sat beneath an ancient oak tree, and the hedge walls created a private room open only to the darkening sky above. Frederick waited until she was seated before he began to speak, and when he did, his words came quickly, as though he had been holding them back for too long. "There is a man, Lord Edmund Bennet, Earl of Ashford. Do you know him?" Arabella searched her memory, finally placing the name with a face she had glimpsed occasionally at society gatherings. "I know of him. A gentleman of perhaps 35, fair-haired, with political connections." She paused, recalling darker rumors. There have been whispers about him. Debts. Scandal. Nothing proven, but much suspected. Frederick's expression darkened further. "The whispers do not tell half of it. Bennet is ruined, financially and morally. He has gambled away his fortune, alienated his family, and is now desperate to recover his position by any means necessary. His estates are mortgaged to the hilt, his creditors grow impatient, and he faces complete disgrace unless he can secure a substantial infusion of capital." Arabella frowned, not understanding what this had to do with her. Surely there are heiresses aplenty for such a man to pursue. "Why tell me of his troubles?" "Because," Frederick said, his voice dropping to a tone of suppressed anger, "you are the solution he has fixed upon. Not for your dowry, which he knows is modest, but for your land." She stared at him in confusion. "My land? I have no land beyond my father's small estate, which provides barely enough income to maintain my mother and sister. The estate itself is entailed and will pass to my cousin upon my mother's death. I am hardly an heiress worth pursuing. It is not the Derbyshire property that interests him." Frederick explained, moving closer to the bench, though he remained standing. "It is your mother's inheritance, the Moorland property." Arabella's breath caught. Her mother's maiden name had been Moorland, and there was indeed a small parcel of land in Kent that had come to her through her maternal grandfather, land that was not entailed and had passed to Arabella as the eldest daughter upon her father's death. It was a modest holding, barely 200 acres of farmland and woods, managed by a local steward and providing a tiny income that helped supplement the family's limited funds. "I do not understand," she said slowly. "The moorland land is worth perhaps £2,000 if sold. Surely that is insufficient to solve Lord Bennet's problems." "It is not the current value that interests him," Frederick said grimly. "It is the location. Your land sits directly adjacent to the proposed route of the new railway line that will connect London to Dover. The railway company has been quietly purchasing rights of way, and your property is one of the key parcels they need. Bennet discovered this through his political connections, and has also learned that the company is prepared to pay 10 times the land's current value to secure it. With that money, he could pay his most pressing debts and restore his credit enough to continue his lifestyle of dissolution." Arabella rose from the bench, her mind racing. "But the land is mine. He cannot simply take it. I would never agree to sell to such a man, even if he offered a fair price." Frederick's expression was grim. "He does not plan to ask your permission, Arabella. He plans to force you into marriage. Once you are his wife, control of your property passes to him automatically. He can sell the land without your consent and use the proceeds as he wishes, leaving you trapped in a marriage to a man of vicious temperament and ruined character." The words hit her, like physical blows. But how could he force such a marriage? I would refuse. My family would protect me. The law requires my consent. Bennet is not a man constrained by law or decency, Frederick said, his voice tight with controlled fury. I have learned through my own sources that he has already laid the groundwork. He has been making inquiries about your habits, your movements, the company you keep. He plans to engineer a compromising situation, To trap you in a scandal that would make marriage to him seem the only way to preserve your reputation. Once your name is ruined, your family would have little choice but to accept his offer, particularly if he presented himself as the gentleman willing to save you from disgrace. Arabella sank back onto the bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her. This could not be happening. Such things occurred in sensation novels, not to ordinary ladies living quiet lives in Bloomsbury. Yet even as she tried to reject Frederick's words, she could not deny the ring of truth in them. She had noticed, now that she thought back, a gentleman matching Bennet's description at several gatherings she had attended, always seeming to be nearby, always watching. She had dismissed it as coincidence, but now it took on a more sinister meaning. "How do you know all this?" she asked, looking up at Frederick's face. "How did you discover his plans?" "I have friends in positions of influence," Frederick replied. "When I noticed Bennet's attention fixed on you at the Pemberton Musicale last month, I made inquiries. What I learned alarmed me enough to take action." His mouth twisted bitterly. "Though my action has caused you pain, for which I am deeply sorry." "The engagement to Lady Henrietta?" Arabella breathed, understanding dawning. "It is part of your plan to protect me." "Yes," Frederick said simply. "Bennet believes I have shown you particular attention over the past 2 seasons. If he suspects that you have any claim on my affections, he might hesitate, fearing that a duke could be a dangerous enemy. But if I am safely engaged to another woman, if I appear to have dismissed you entirely, then he will believe the path is clear. He will not suspect that I am actually watching his every move, positioning myself to intervene if he makes any attempt to enact his scheme." Arabella pressed a hand to her chest, where her heart felt as though it might break through her ribs. "You have sacrificed your own happiness to protect me. You have bound yourself to a woman you do not love, all to keep me safe from a threat I did not even know existed." Frederick's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer, his hand rising as though to touch her face before he caught himself and let it fall back to his side. "My happiness was never in question, Arabella. It was decided 2 years ago, from the moment you laughed at my terrible poetry at the Moorland Musicale, from the moment you told me that sincerity mattered more than technical perfection in art. I have been yours from that night, whether you knew it or not, whether anything could come of it or not." The admission hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility and pain. Arabella rose again, moving toward him without conscious thought, her whole being drawn to this man who had just revealed the depth of his regard in the most devastating way possible. "But what of you, Frederick?" she whispered, using his given name without thinking, without caring about propriety or proper address. "What of your happiness? What of what might have been between us if circumstances were different?" His pale eyes blazed in the gathering darkness, and for a moment she thought he might close the distance between them, might take her in his arms as she desperately wished he would. But he held himself rigidly in check, every line of his body speaking of restraint and sacrifice. "What might have been does not matter," he said, though his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "What matters is keeping you safe. Bennet is dangerous, Arabella. He is a man with nothing left to lose, which makes him capable of anything. I could not stand by and watch him destroy you. I would rather bind myself to a marriage of convenience for the rest of my life than see you trapped with such a man." "But Lady Henrietta?" Arabella protested, tears pricking at her eyes. "To tie yourself to a woman you do not love, to live a lie for years, perhaps for a lifetime." "Henrietta understands the arrangement," Frederick said. "She has her own reasons for accepting an engagement that is more strategic than romantic. We have an understanding, she and I. The marriage, if it comes to that, will be one of mutual respect, if not passion. She gets the title and position she desires, and I get a duchess who will not expect from me what I cannot give." His meaning was painfully clear. He could not give love to Lady Henrietta because his heart was already given to Arabella herself, given without hope of return or reciprocation. The generosity of his sacrifice, the magnitude of what he was offering, overwhelmed her completely. She reached out, her hand finding his in the darkness, and felt his fingers close around hers with a grip that bordered on desperate. "I cannot accept this," she said, though she did not release his hand. "I cannot allow you to sacrifice everything for my sake. There must be another way. We could go to the authorities. We could warn my family. I could leave London entirely. Every option has risks." Frederick replied, his thumb stroking across the back of her hand in a caress that seemed unconscious. "If we go to the authorities, Bennet's political connections might protect him. And worse, he would know we are aware of his plans. He would simply adjust his strategy, perhaps act more quickly before we can counter him. If you flee London, he might follow, and you would be more vulnerable away from the protection of society. The engagement to Henrietta is the safest option because it allows me to remain close, to monitor Bennet's movements, to position myself to intervene the moment he makes any move against you." "But you should not have to do this alone," Arabella insisted. "Let me help. Let me be part of whatever plan you are making." Frederick's expression softened slightly. "You are helping simply by being aware of the danger. I needed you to know why I announced my engagement so publicly, why I have seemed to distance myself from you. I could not bear the thought that you believed I had simply dismissed you, that our friendship meant nothing to me." His free hand did rise to her face then, his fingertips brushing her cheek with a tenderness that made her eyes close. "You have been the light in my life for 2 years, Arabella. Every conversation, every dance, every moment in your presence has been treasured beyond what I can express. I needed you to know that before I became unavailable to you in the eyes of the world." Arabella opened her eyes to find his face very close to hers, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, could count the darker flecks in his pale irises, could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. In that moment, surrounded by hedge walls and gathering mist, hidden from the world that would judge and condemn, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she had hidden even from herself. She was not just attracted to Frederick Wentworth. She was not merely fond of him or admiring of his character. She loved him with a depth and completeness that terrified her, loved him with every fibre of her being, and the knowledge that he returned her feelings, even as he bound himself to another, was both the greatest joy and the deepest pain she had ever known. "I love you," she whispered, the words escaping before she could call them back. "I know I should not say it. I know it changes nothing. But I cannot let you make this sacrifice without knowing that your feelings are returned, that you are loved as deeply as you love." For a moment, just one perfect, impossible moment, Frederick's control shattered. He pulled her against him, his arms coming around her with a fierceness that spoke of long restraint finally breaking, and his lips found hers in a kiss that was both desperate and tender, claiming and cherishing. Arabella melted into his embrace, her hands fisting in his coat, her whole world narrowing to the sensation of his mouth on hers, the solid strength of his body, the overwhelming rightness of being held by him. But the moment could not last. Frederick drew back with visible effort, his breathing unsteady, his hands trembling slightly as he set her gently away from him. "Forgive me," he said roughly. "I should not have done that. I had no right." "You had every right," Arabella countered, though she too was shaking. "We both did. If this is all we can have, one moment of truth in a maze of shadows, then I am grateful for it." Frederick's expression was anguished. "You deserve so much more than stolen moments and secret meetings. You deserve a man who can court you openly, who can offer you marriage and a future without shadows. You deserve happiness, Arabella, as do you," she replied softly. "But we do not always get what we deserve in this life, do we? We get what circumstances allow." He had no answer for that, and for a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of impossibility settling over them like the mist that now filled the maze completely. Finally, Frederick straightened, visibly pulling his ducal armor back into place, though she could see the cost it exacted in the tightness around his eyes. "You should return home before you are missed," he said, his voice once again controlled, though still rough at the edges. "I will wait here for a quarter hour before I leave to ensure we are not seen together." Arabella nodded, knowing he was right, but hating the necessity of parting. She moved toward the path that would lead her back to the maze entrance, back to the world of propriety and pretense, but paused after a few steps to look back at him. "Frederick," she said, and he turned to her immediately, hope and pain warring in his expression. "Whatever happens, whatever comes of this tangle we find ourselves in, know that I trust you. I trust your judgment and your plan, and I will wait, however long it takes, until we can be together openly, or until you release me from that hope. Do not wait for me, Arabella," he said, though his voice broke on the words. "You are young yet. You should find a good man who can offer you everything I cannot." "I am 23, she replied with a sad smile. "Hardly in my first youth, and as for finding another man, I fear my heart is quite settled on its choice. Even if I can never have you, I will have no one else." "Then we are both doomed to lives of longing," Frederick said quietly, "for I am equally decided. No woman will ever hold my heart as you do." With that bleak acknowledgment hanging between them, Arabella turned and walked into the mist, following the hedge walls by touch more than sight, her eyes too blurred with tears to see clearly. Behind her, she heard nothing, but she felt Frederick's presence like a physical thing, felt his gaze following her until the twisting paths took her from his sight. The journey home passed in a blur, and it was only when she was safely back in her own chamber, the door locked behind her, that Arabella allowed herself to collapse onto her bed and weep for what she had found and lost in the space of a single twilight meeting. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The week following the meeting in Vauxhall Gardens passed in a strange, suspended state where Arabella moved through the rhythms of daily life while feeling utterly disconnected from them. She attended the usual round of morning calls with her mother, sat through musicales and card parties with appropriate expressions of interest, and pretended that her world had not been fundamentally altered by the revelations in the maze. Yet beneath the surface calm, her mind churned constantly with thoughts of Frederick, of the danger Lord Bennet represented, and of the impossible situation in which they all found themselves trapped. She had not seen Frederick since that twilight meeting, though she scanned every ballroom and gathering with desperate hope, knowing even as she did so that he would be avoiding her presence to maintain the fiction of his engagement to Lady Henrietta. The newspapers had indeed published notice of the betrothal, describing it in glowing terms as the union of two great families, and speculating about when the wedding might take place and where the couple might reside. Each mention was a small knife to Arabella's heart, yet she understood the necessity of the charade and took some cold comfort in knowing that Frederick's feelings were unchanged even if his circumstances were not. What she had not anticipated was how quickly Lord Bennet would move once he believed Frederick safely occupied elsewhere. The first indication came at a reception at Lady Tilney's townhouse, where Arabella found herself cornered near the refreshment table by a fair-haired gentleman whose smile did not reach his pale blue eyes. Lord Bennet was handsome in a dissipated way, with features that might have been classical had they not been marked by the signs of excessive living, faint lines of debauchery around his mouth, a slight puffiness beneath his eyes that spoke of too much wine and too little sleep, and a restlessness in his manner that suggested a man constantly seeking the next pleasure or profit. He had approached with all the appearance of casual politeness, commenting on the weather and the quality of Lady Tilney's refreshments, but his eyes had lingered on Arabella in a way that made her skin crawl. She had extricated herself as quickly as propriety allowed, pleading a need to join her mother, but not before she caught the flash of calculation in his expression, the way he watched her retreat with the focused intensity of a predator selecting prey. The second encounter had been at the theatre 3 nights later,